Continuing on from the Alien movie analysis, I thought I would give some further remarks concerning the artistic influences by none other than H.R. Giger, as detailed especially in the first film. Before we start, however, I do want to give some due credit to Ridley Scott's direction in the film, where I feel he steers the film through a very artistic lens, as he does with his other masterpiece film, namely that of Blade Runner. This can be in no small part be attributed to his background in advertising, where the medium of making short mini films essentially for a commercial product is often laced with the same nonsensical logic that one possesses while sleeping. In other words, this dream logic helps to inspire visually emotive experiences, which often draws upon dreamy contemplative sequences that one often associates with that of dreams. While this is very prone to the use of surrealism, as is done, for instance, with the work of famed director David Lynch, who not surprisingly has also done commercials, with Ripley's direction, it is first and foremost a visual sensation of lingering in conjunction with a reflective, slowed down visual atmosphere that takes precedence. There is a wonderful example of this in Alien, where upon the initial presentation of the derelict ship, that is, the first time we, the viewers, see the alien construction, there is a corresponding enforcement of a strong sensation of otherworldliness, which again does much to promote a sense of curiosity and awe. Given the more action pro nature of the film, especially towards the last third of the film, this initial preponderance and reflective nature works as a nice counterplay against the more movement dense scenes later on. This visual enforcement element is again seen in the direction of the film when we encounter the space jockey, or as Kane excavates the alien birth chamber in the egg storage room. Here, we viewers are treated to a wonderful long-range shot where the spacious cave uses some clever Hollywood trickery by, I believe, the use of matte paintings in the background. It is here I want to begin our discussion of H.R. Giger, of whom, of course, the ingenious egg design is attributed. The eggs function above else as a signifier of something that is alive and by logical extension biological in nature. On a psychological level, the eggs in terms of a horror film play into a fundamental phobia of human beings by essentially exploiting the natural curiousness that comprises human beings wishing to get a peek of what is really contained on the inside of those alluring eggs. In addition, there has often been placed a special emphasis on the preciousness of eggs, as in the fable of the goose that laid the golden eggs, which serves as a cautionary tale of avoiding myopic short term interests in favor of cultivating a valuable resource. The corresponding association or aura, then, of the xenomorph eggs may at first glance seem to be suggestive of something concerning a holy imagery, but this turns out to be very deceptive indeed, as the contents of the eggs are revealed to be more akin to that of anti religious sexually charged imagery, where the penetrating force of both the facehugger and later the fully developed xenomorph creature must invoke truly horrid images. This religious mockery is also explored, as I alluded to in my last Alien Part 3 analysis, where the final meal of Cain later in the film serves as a contortion of the Last Supper scene in the Bible. More explicitly, we may look at an earlier work of Giger, aptly named Satan 1 from 1977, where we find a shadowy Satan figure with very industrial design looking horns in conjunction with the religious mockery of Jesus, here in the guise of a slingshot. One can only speculate too, as if Giger here is making a remark in reference to the intrusion of Christianity through proselytization, where the message of Christ is being shoved, or in this case, slingshotted down our throats. Borrowing a page out of Greek mythology, we also have the painting of Lee One from 1974, modeled after real life Swiss actress Lee Tobler, who was at one point romantically attached to Giger, which bears a striking resemblance to that of the Greek mythological figure of Medusa. We can again see this as a sort of self referential comment on Giger's own work, being that of through evoking a sense of nightmarish terror when often confronted with the subtextual sexual violence found in, for example, the xenomorph creature, one subconsciously merely glances over the work and thus skips over the meticulously lurid details comprising his artworks. As is typical in the art of H.R. Giger, there's a focus on the re-imaging, or rather a contortion of familiar objects, where the mechanical tapestry of his art is interwoven with that of the biological. This can be seen throughout his career in the piece The Tourist 9, Hanging Alien Looking Dying from 1982, or Biomechanoid from 2010. One can even see the elongated cephaloid structure of the xenomorph through the lens of that of a skeletal whale head. Take, for instance, the image of the sperm whale, which belongs to the category of toothed whales, and of which we know has a very predatorial tendencies, hunting their main prey of that of giant squids, which are found at very deep waters. There even seems to be some reference to this in an early depiction of the alien creature from Geiger's 1976 Necronomicon 4, where we may interpret the cephaloid structure as containing that of two faces essentially, one being an earlier inspiration for the xenomorph face along the right side, while the left side of the skull seems to bear a strong resemblance to that of a sperm whale's head, with its protruding, bulky fat head along with a tiny lower jaw, albeit there seems to be no appearance of the characteristic blowhole on top of the skull. Further animal contortions may be seen in the iconic facehugger creation of Giger, where we may divide the creature using a plane of bilateral symmetry, where the posterior section of the facehugger resembles that of a manipulated mouse, with a tail bearing the resemblance of a rattlesnake, while the interior region has the appearance of that of a spider with protruding dexter like appendages. Falling naturally into Giger's hands, there is also that of the Dune sandworm, which must have been very natural for Giger to incorporate into his artwork while working with Jodorowsky on the original Dune movie, as the creature naturally lends itself to the animalistic manipulations so frequent in Giger's work. We see here the fearsome shark like teeth on the worm creature as it is seen devouring its prey. It is also interesting to note that the temptation here for Giger to include some biomechanical contraption is too strong in this scenario, as the phallus like structure the worm is devouring may be seen as being on the other end of a vaginal dentata in the form of the predator worm. This again alludes to the often latent undertones of taboo sexuality coupled with biomechanical dreamscape constructions found within his artworks. This seems to be somewhat of a strong trademark of Giger, as the phallic, along with other sexual references, are on full display, even in Giger's earliest works, which often gathers inspiration from a more surreal palette, as is the case, for example, with 1968's homage to S. Beckett II. One can also see here clearly the inspiration he must have taken from Salvador Dali, who he was also briefly acquainted with in his lifetime, although I have to say that his best work certainly corresponds with that of a later period when he had more ditched the overt Dali-esque references, which takes up a substantial part of his earliest period. I still think of Giger as incorporating surrealism into his works, although certainly in a less overt fashion as Dali himself, or as that of Francis Bacon, for example. Note also that one may see the references to contortions or manipulations of animals to that of the Dutch master painter Hieronymus Bosch from the late Middle Ages, who often involved such fantastical depiction as is seen in his magnus opus triptych oil painting The Garden of Earthly Delights. As another remark, there are certainly times when viewing his artworks where one may wonder if it is not just as apt to view Giger as that of an industrial designer in contrast to the more obvious role as that of an artist. It certainly should not come as a surprise when we learn of his educational background in both architecture and industrial design, corresponding to the early 60s. There is also, in conjunction with the film Alien, a clear inspiration from that of scientific inventions, most prominently through his biomechanical architecture of both the derelict ship as well as that of the surrounding habitat of the eggs. This is further emphasized through the integration of the space jockey of, although biological design, which has been infused with its chair and by extension the ship altogether, essentially blurring the lines between the technological and the archaic life form, all integrated in a dependency relationship in order to commandeer the vessel of the derelict. This same fully life supported integration of man with that of the mechanical is also seen in 1990's movie The Matrix, where Neo wakes up to find himself in the horrid industrial landscape of the post apocalyptic world, where the machines very much are the dominant species, who have in turn exerted control but are still dependent on the energy extraction that they gain from human beings. Geiger can be seen then in many ways just as much of an industrial artistic inventor when working on movies, where he not only is able to steer the gaze of the public towards to that of a two-dimensional plane in the case of his artworks, or a three-dimensional space in terms of sculptures, but in the case of set design he is able to construct massive immersive environments for the celluloid medium. It is perhaps therefore that the works of Giger fit as a hand in glove, so to say, when working with movies, as his industrial design naturally lends itself to the manipulation of ever-grading surroundings, as is done most prominently in the first Alien film. One may also expand this interpretation for Giger's predilection of industrial inventions, drawing inspiration from that of both science and science fiction, when we consider the fact that his instrument of choice was that of an airbrush, of which he was introduced rather early on in his career. Through using compressed air to force paint through a nozzle, Giger is essentially creating his very own world space through the vantage point of a scientific instrumentalist, where ideas are being transferred as instruments being realized in the Hollywood machinery that encompasses a big budget movie production. There is also the additional aspect of real life motion, which seems very complementary to his own works when working in the medium of film, and it should not come as a surprise that Giger worked very closely with the special effects team on especially the first Alien film, where he was active in the process of sculpting and turning his designs into 3D space realities. I think it is perhaps the sense of vividness that Giger's mechanical contraptions invoke that make it so suitable for being constructed in 3D space. A large part of what makes Alien such a scary film, then, is the sense of biological evolvement that must take place after the famous chestburster scene, where we as audience members must delve into our own psyche before being confronted with the fully grown xenomorph, where we are initially unsure of both the nature and appearance the creature will inhabit. I also believe the initial idea of Ridley Scott was that the xenomorph creatures themselves should have a very short lifespans, which makes sense given the rapid growth of the chestburster into a fully grown adult. Under confrontation with the xenomorph, there is therefore a sense of envisioned decay taking place, which I always associate with the at times heavy breathing, such as when Ripley confronts the alien queen in Aliens, or the all too referenced drippingly salivating creature which seems to want to maximize each second with that of its prey. Perhaps it is in some subconscious way aware of its own fragile biological clock, or it is as subservient to its own biological programming as that of many lower level insects. In any case, the sense of motion to Giger's mechanical world building is really something that elevates the art. There's a wonderful reference for this in a YouTube video, which I will leave links to in the description, which adds motion to Giger's artworks. Returning to the egg chamber scene in the first Alien film, we are witness not only to that of the biomechanical surroundings, but also sort of tactile homogeneous tapestry, where a vast space illusion is at display in the chamber along with the signifiers of biological life forms given by the many eggs. This sort of effect makes it more difficult for the viewers to know where to place the right perspective, if we may use this word, and again is very much in line with some ideas found in the contemporary art world. One may draw parallels, for example, to the American abstract expressionist artist of Mark Rothko, where much like Giger, his often large canvases are meant to be absorbed as a single piece and does not therefore give a clear indication to the observer of where to place emphasis in terms of perspective. Rothko's works have also often been related to that of a dark pessimistic tone, much like Giger, although as I will comment on later in the video, I find Giger's work to be much more hopeful than most, although he of course draws inspirations from themes stemming from nightmares. This lack of explicit perspective generated in the egg scene can again be found in some of Giger's most famous works, including the infamous Biomechanical Landscape series and the work NY City. Now, to address some of the critiques levied at Giger's work, I will address what I hear most commonly, although, as is often the case with great art, his work is that of a polarizing nature, meaning for many people it is usually the case that you either love or hate his works. Perhaps it's due to the dark nature of his works, which was immediately picked up upon by Jodorowsky, who made a similar remark in the 2013 documentary Jodorowsky's Dune, where he remarks something to the effect of Giger's art being that of a fantastical nature, although of a dark nature. In any case, there are certainly a plethora of artists to choose from if the thematically dark themes are not to your liking. More explicit criticisms often point out the monotonous nature of his works and what they perceive as of little to no progression in his work. I admit that Giger's work would not be classified as that of a highly versatile artist, but in my opinion, versatility seems to be very often overrated in terms of art critique. As an example, we can mention that of the greatest masters of early medieval art, who were often working in the confines of a small range of artistic themes, where the arts were promoted solely by the church, and there certainly were built in constrictions as to what one could render artistically. One could mention here as an example the Byzantine mosaic artists who certainly had an influence on later medieval paintings, as well in more general terms on Russian decorative arts, and which also influenced the highly complex nature of Islamic decorative arts. Likewise, in the art of music, Bach, who is, in my opinion, the greatest composer who ever lived, was considered highly anachronistic by his peers, choosing to compose in the orthodox style of fugues in the last remaining years of his life, such as that of his unfinished masterpiece, The Art of the Fugue. I will add here the caveat, however, that there certainly exist forward thinking musical inventions from Bach, but I won't go into any further detail in this video. Just to clarify, when I say here that Giger's art is non versatile, I'm speaking more of his lack of thematic development and strict consistency in style, which comprises his artworks. I will, however, point out here that one can find more varied works from Giger than you would think, especially in terms of his earlier drawings, where there are even instances where the overt sexual thematics are left exempt. His spiraling staircases from the book Necronomicon come to mind, or his series of green landscapes, even drawing inspiration from The Lord of the Rings. I will mention as previously that he did not possess, in my opinion, the same raw talent for surrealism that Dali possesses, and therefore his more Dali-esque attempts are among the most lacking in terms of artistic output, in my opinion. I would say in general that his strongest output seems to be after more mastering the tool of the airbrush, stemming from the period of the early mid 70s, with both Lee 1 and Necronom 4 being prime examples of that strong artistic output. In regards to his airbrush paintings, there is the added criticism that some people find his paintings to be too glossy, but it's exactly that sort of glossiness which seems, in my opinion, to strengthen his work, as it adds to the illusion of vitality and movement, which, as I have previously mentioned, are very important characteristics of his works. There may be a stronger criticism of Giger's work in terms of how his biomechanical devices would function in real life scenarios. I imagine if he had lived longer, he would have taken a greater interest in how his mechanical designs would function and the engineering behind them. This is especially true if we consider the proliferation of 3D printers and the distribution of free computer graphics software such as Blender in our age. It is also something that stands out from the work of Da Vinci in how his interest and proclivity towards engineering affected his artworks. Even Salvador Dali would often invite scientists such as physicists to converse with instead of artists, as he felt the inventiveness through the specialization of science could provide as creative, if not more so, ideas than that of the art world. However, I should add that I would have to study Giger's output in more detail in order to see how well this criticism holds up. There have also been some who have accused Giger of sexism in his art, and while I admit that there are more explicit sexual representation which draws attention to pornography, many of his works lends itself equally to that of the homoerotic. The xenomorph creature itself can be seen in terms of semiotics as a sign of sexual violence through rape, which does in turn not distinguish between the sexes. I think it's obviously going to be more relational among women, but it certainly has the same potential to signify the same type of fear for men. Lastly, I will give some of my own thoughts as to why I feel Giger's art is more optimistic than that I feel it often presents itself to the general public. I was also pleased to learn while researching this video that Giger said something to the same effect regarding his own works. While I affirm the same often dark, lurid, nightmarish themes which are present in his works, and which will always lend itself nicely to tattoos, I find his art world to be considerably more optimistic than darker themed contemporary artists such as Francis Bacon and Zdzislaw Bekczynski. One can take the characteristic post-apocalyptical world of Bekczynski, which seems more than anything devoid of life, and which brings to memory Einstein's famous quote about the war after a potential World War III being fought with sticks and stones, after what we may only surmise would have been an eradication event of divine proportions. What we are left with then is a post-historic civilization where the potential life decay is much higher than that of human survival, and where battles are being fought not in terms of ideas of progression, but that of mere basic necessities in a vast barren landscape. This is in contrast to Giger's art, and especially the alien species itself, where at the very least we get plenty of art pointing towards that of the social, as is seen by all stages of the alien creature. The xenomorph is after all seen as a master predator, where one may imagine a scenario where the creatures are left to their own vices on an isolated planet far away from human contact, perhaps even with enough technological development from some given species. There might also arise a scenario where it's possible to isolate the creatures from that of civilian contact on the same planet, making the xenomorphs in status not unlike the fearsome predators lurking in the wild of our own planet. I admit the last scenario might be stretching things a bit, and if there is a lesson to learn from the Alien franchise itself, it is to avoid cohabitation with the creatures, but nonetheless it is certainly a coherent theory at the very least. The line of thinking might also be very complementary to that of moral relativism, which in a normative sense places emphasis on tolerating widely divergent moral practices, be it in this setting of a totally different species, although these remarks should not be taken as absolute descriptions of the position. As a final remark on the less bleak representations of Giger's art, we may argue that his art often represents taboo sexual references in order to facilitate further discussions on sexual preferences, which may be taken as widely differing in many both cultural and individual settings. To summarize, we have then looked at various themes in Giger's artworks, such as that of blending the biological with that of the mechanical, referred often by the artist himself as the biomechanical, and his place among other contemporary artists. In addition, we briefly discussed some critiques, and finally I gave an argument as to why I find his art as less bleak than is often taken to be the norm.